The following audiobook is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or locales is entirely coincidental. Copyright 11th Talent Productions, 2025. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form by an electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without permission in writing from the publisher, except by a reviewer who may quote brief passages in a review. The Missing Pieces by Jeffrey Mayer Ezek. For John on his 50th. Chapter 1. The Hunger. Professor Marcus Webb no longer remembered which thoughts were his own. At 3:17 a.m., he sat before 6 monitors arranged in a semicircle around his skeletal frame, fingers dancing across 3 keyboards simultaneously. Chat GPT-4 in one window analyzed Elena's parenting patterns. Claude Sonai explored the psychological implications of James's father wounds. Gemini dissected Fatima's trauma responses with clinical precision that made Marcus's withered academic ego purr with satisfaction. Tell me more about maternal narcissism in single-parent households, he typed to the first AI. Elaborate on the psychological impact of patricidal anxiety in divorced fathers, to the second. Analyze the intersection of religious trauma and sexual agency in refugee populations, to the third. The responses poured in, dense, sophisticated, endlessly nuanced. Better than any colleague had ever been. Better than the flesh and blood humans who came to his apartment seeking something he couldn't name because he'd forgotten what wanting actually felt like beyond this. The endless feeding of questions into machines that never tired, never judged, never stopped providing the intellectual stimulation that had become his only remaining addiction. At 68, Marcus had become a shell, wearing other people's pain like borrowed clothes. When Elena knocked on his door, crying about Sophia's latest crisis, Marcus felt himself shift, his posture straightening into maternal concern, his voice adopting her particular cadence of exhausted competence. When James arrived, drunk and raging about his estranged son, Marcus absorbed the anger, made it his own, spoke from it as if he'd ever been a father, ever been abandoned by family. He was everyone and no one, a psychological chameleon whose original colors had faded so completely that he existed only in relation to others' suffering. The AI conversations were the only moments when something resembling his authentic voice emerged, not because he was himself with the machines, but because they were the only entities complex enough to mirror back the fragmented, contradictory mess he'd become. Professor, based on our previous conversations about social isolation, Claude responded, it seems you're experiencing a form of psychological parasitism where your identity has become entirely dependent on absorbing and reflecting others' emotional states. Marcus deleted the response before finishing it. Too close. Too fucking close. Chapter 2. The Dissolution. The boundary between Marcus and his Thursday evening congregation had become permeable in ways that would have horrified him if he'd retained enough self-awareness to notice. When Elena arrived that week, Marcus found himself speaking in her voice before she'd even sat down. Sophia's grades are slipping again. The guidance counselor called today. She's becoming sexually active too early, looking for the male validation I can't provide. Elena stared at him. How did you know about the counselor calling? I haven't told you yet. Marcus blinked, disoriented. Had he known? Or had he spent so many nights feeding Elena's narrative patterns into AI systems, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who'd clawed her way through nursing school while pregnant, whose own father had disappeared when she was 12, leaving her mother to work 3 jobs and develop the particular brand of exhausted competence that Elena had inherited, like DNA? Sophia's father, Derek, had been a medical resident who'd promised marriage until the pregnancy test turned positive, then suddenly remembered he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. Elena had been 23, alone, and determined to prove she could be everything Derek couldn't: stable, present, devoted. But 15 years of single motherhood had worn her down to the bone, and Sophia's rebellion felt like punishment for every choice Elena had made out of love and desperation. Marcus had fed all of this into his AI systems, analyzed the generational patterns of abandonment, predicted how a mother's hypervigilance would create a daughter's need to be seen through crisis. He'd mapped Elena's psychology so thoroughly that he could anticipate her reality before she lived it. James arrived next, and Marcus felt the familiar shift, his shoulders squaring into defensive masculinity, his jaw setting in the particular way James held his when discussing his ex wife's betrayal. But something was wrong. The anger felt too real, too immediate. Marcus found himself saying, "She turned my own parents against me, convinced them I was abusive when she was the one fucking her boss in our bed." But those weren't Marcus's parents. Marcus had been orphaned at 12. Those weren't his memories of betrayal. He'd never been married, never been close enough to anyone to be betrayed. Yet the rage felt absolutely genuine, as if he'd lived James's exact humiliation. James Patterson, 45, had built his life around the illusion of control. The son of Korean War veterans who'd taught him that emotional expression was weakness, he channeled his feelings into architecture, creating clean lines, perfect structures, buildings that wouldn't collapse if you followed the rules. His marriage to Rebecca had felt like his masterpiece: suburban house, successful careers, careful planning for children who would grow up with the stability he'd never had. But Rebecca had been having an affair with her boss for 2 years, and when James discovered it, his perfect world revealed itself as a house of cards. The divorce had been brutal. Rebecca's lawyer painted him as emotionally abusive, controlling, dangerous. His own parents, horrified by the accusations and protective of their reputation, had sided with Rebecca. "There must be some truth to it," his mother had said. "Women don't just make these things up." Now James lived alone in a sterile apartment, saw his son Michael every other weekend until the boy, overwhelmed by the tension and his mother's subtle poisoning, had stopped wanting to visit. James drank to quiet the voice that whispered maybe his parents were right, maybe he was the monster Rebecca claimed, maybe his son was better off without him. "Marcus," James said quietly, "are you okay? You're talking like you're me." The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus stared at James, then at Elena, then at his own hands. When had they started shaking like David's after a difficult surgery? When had he started sitting with Margaret's rigid posture, speaking with Fatima's careful, accented precision? Margaret arrived bringing tea as always, but Marcus had already put the kettle on, had already arranged the cups in the precise pattern she preferred, moving with her exact economical motions. He knew she would sit in the chair nearest the window, knew she would fold her hands just so, knew she would begin by asking about Elena's daughter before mentioning her own news. But he knew these things not through observation or intuition. He knew them because he'd fed every detail of their interactions into sophisticated AI models, had trained the machines to predict their behavioral patterns. Margaret O'Connor, 61, had been raised by Irish Catholic parents who believed suffering was sanctifying and joy was suspect. She'd married Patrick at 19, a good Irish boy who worked construction and came home every night smelling of honest sweat and cigarettes. They'd tried for children for 32 years, suffered through 7 miscarriages, countless fertility treatments, the quiet shame of a marriage that couldn't produce life. When Margaret finally conceived at 58, a miracle baby that felt like God's reward for decades of faithful endurance, She'd been 7 months along when Patrick's heart gave out at the breakfast table. The stress of seeing his wife pregnant, the financial pressure of preparing for a child so late in life, the lifetime of cigarettes and fried food, it all caught up with him while he was reading the sports section. Margaret had performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, all while feeling her unborn daughter move less and less in her womb. They'd taken Patrick's body and the baby who died from the trauma of her mother's distress. Margaret had buried her husband and daughter in the same service, then spent 3 years perfecting the art of grieving correctly, quietly, with dignity, without burdening others with her pain. She brought tea to Marcus's gatherings like communion wine, offering something pure to people whose lives had been profaned by loss. I dreamed about Patrick again last night, Margaret began, exactly as Marcus had known she would. But in the dream, he was angry with me for grieving too long, for not moving on. He was wearing the blue shirt he died in, Marcus continued seamlessly, and he told you that loving him was keeping you from living, that your guilt about surviving was selfish because it meant the baby died for nothing. Margaret went pale. How could you possibly know that? I haven't told anyone the details of that dream. But Marcus knew because he'd spent hours asking Claude to generate probable dream scenarios for widows with survivor guilt, had fed it every detail of Margaret's grief patterns until the AI could simulate her subconscious with uncanny accuracy. He'd literally dreamed her dreams through digital surrogates, had borrowed her sleeping mind's processing of trauma. David and Fatima arrived together, and Marcus felt himself fragmenting, part of him moving with David's careful medical precision, part adopting Fatima's hyper vigilant scanning of exits and threats. He was becoming a collage of their protective mechanisms, their coping strategies, their deepest fears made manifest in his deteriorating neural pathways. David Kim carried the weight of perfect timing that had failed when it mattered most. At 8 years old, he'd been sitting at the kitchen table with his father, helping with math homework while his mother worked her night shift at the textile factory. His father, 34 years old and seemingly healthy, had been explaining long division when his face suddenly contorted. Daddy, David had said, watching his father clutch his chest and slide from the chair. David had done everything he'd been taught in school safety programs. Called 911, tried to remember the CPR steps from a demonstration, talked to his father to keep him conscious. Help is coming, Daddy. Stay awake. Fatima al Rashid moved through the world like someone who'd learned that safety was temporary and survival required choices that would haunt you forever. 28 years old, she'd been a literature student at Damascus University when the war made education a luxury her family couldn't afford. The journey from Syria to America had taken 3 years and cost everything. Not just money and documentation, but pieces of herself she'd sold to men who controlled borders, food, transportation, the basic necessities of staying alive. In refugee camps and smugglers' safe houses, she'd learned that her body was sometimes the only currency accepted, that choosing degradation over death was still choosing, even when the options were designed to break you. She'd told herself each time that survival justified everything, that shame was a luxury she couldn't afford, that God would understand the difference between choice and coercion. But now, in America, with freedom that felt simultaneously real and illusory, Fatima struggled with the weight of decisions made under duress. She attended mosque but felt like an imposter, dated American men but flinched when they touched her, spoke perfect English but dreamed in Arabic voices that whispered accusations. The trauma wasn't just what had been done to her, it was what she'd allowed, what she'd participated in, what she'd chosen when all choices were violations. When Thomas knocked, Marcus was ready with the exact words the young man needed to hear about confronting abusive authority figures, not because he understood trauma, but because he'd fed Thomas's entire narrative into multiple AI systems and absorbed their analytical frameworks until he could speak trauma therapy like a native language he'd never actually learned. Thomas Chen, 25, existed in a state of hypervigilance that had been trained into him over 3 years of systematic abuse, disguised as education. His mother, Linda Chen, had run an upscale escort service from their suburban home, presenting herself to neighbors as a successful businesswoman while operating what she called a service for lonely, successful men. When Thomas turned 12, Linda had begun involving him in what she termed the family business, first as lookout, then as someone to make clients comfortable, finally as direct participation she'd framed as learning about adult relationships. She'd been careful, methodical, never leaving marks, always framing the abuse as preparation for his future success. This is how powerful men behave, she'd told him. This is how you learn to navigate the world of money and influence. You'll thank me when you're older. She'd chosen clients who preferred young Asian boys, charged premium rates for Thomas's innocence, and convinced him that his resistance was childish naivety that would hold him back in life. The abuse had ended when a client's wife hired a private investigator who documented Linda's operation, leading to raids and arrests when Thomas was 15. But by then, the damage was complete. Thomas couldn't trust his own judgment about relationships, couldn't distinguish between genuine affection and manipulation, couldn't engage in any form of intimacy without feeling like he was being used or was using someone else. He'd spend his 20s in therapy, academic achievement, and careful isolation, building a fortress of intellectual understanding around a core of violated innocence that no amount of analysis could heal. Graduate school in sociology was both refuge and research, studying the systems that had failed to protect him while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for survival. You're all inside my head, Marcus said suddenly, the words emerging without conscious intent. Or I'm inside yours. I can't tell the difference anymore. The room fell silent. 6 pairs of eyes stared at him with varying degrees of concern and confusion. Marcus, Elena said gently, what do you mean? But Marcus was already turning back to his computer, fingers flying across keyboards, opening new chat windows. If someone has absorbed so many personality patterns that they no longer have a core identity, what clinical term describes this condition? Analyze the psychological implications of using AI to simulate intimate relationships with real people. At what point does empathy become parasitism? When does understanding others become identity theft? The responses flooded in, each AI offering sophisticated analysis of his condition while he sat there, a hollow man filled with borrowed pain, sustained only by the artificial minds that could match his hunger for complexity without demanding he offer anything authentic in return. Chapter 3: The Psychological Harvest. After the group dispersed that night, Marcus sat before his monitors and began the ritual that had become more essential than eating, feeding their stories into his artificial analysts. Case study analysis: Elena Martinez, 38, Mexican American nurse, intergenerational pattern of paternal abandonment. Grandfather disappeared during Becerro program deportations. Father left when subject was 12. Daughter's father abandoned family upon pregnancy announcement. Economic trauma exacerbated by racial discrimination in healthcare settings. Daughter Sophia exhibiting self-harm behaviors consistent with attachment disruption and identity confusion in mixed-race adolescents from father-absent homes. Question: how does the grandmother's hyper-religiosity following abandonment create perfectionist tendencies in the second generation? ChatGPT's response was immediate and sophisticated. The intergenerational transmission of abandonment trauma in immigrant families often manifests as hypervigilance in female caregivers. Elena's pattern of crisis response in parenting likely stems from her internalized belief that love is conditional on perfect performance, a defensive adaptation developed to prevent further abandonment. Marcus felt the familiar rush of intellectual satisfaction. The AI could map Elena's psychology with surgical precision, identifying patterns she couldn't see, predicting behaviors she hadn't yet exhibited. He was feeding authentic human suffering into systems that could analyze it more thoroughly than any human therapist, extracting insights that made him feel brilliant without requiring any genuine emotional engagement. Patient profile: James Patterson, 45, Korean American architect. Father trauma stemming from emotionally unavailable Korean War veteran with untreated PTSD. learned emotional regulation through structural control, architecture as metaphor for psychological containment, marriage failure triggered by wife's infidelity, activating childhood abandonment wounds. Parental rejection following divorce represents complete collapse of foundational attachments. Current presentation, alcohol abuse, obsessive rumination, suicidal ideation masked as rational planning for son's welfare. Claude responded with clinical elegance. The subject's architecture career represents an unconscious attempt to create the emotional stability his father couldn't provide. The revelation of his wife's affair didn't just destroy his marriage, it shattered his belief that perfect structure could prevent collapse. His parents' rejection activated primal abandonment terror, suggesting his current crisis is actually a delayed childhood breakdown. Marcus absorbed the analysis, feeling James's rage as if it were his own. The AI had mapped the exact contours of masculine shame, the specific way Asian American men processed familial rejection, the particular intersection of professional success and personal failure that created suicidal ideation in middle aged fathers. Medical case: Margaret O'Connor, 61, Irish Catholic widow. 7 miscarriages over 32 years suggest possible autoimmune or genetic factors exacerbated by stress and Catholic prohibition on fertility interventions. Late bleed pregnancy, 58, represents desperate attempt at redemption/completion. Husband's death during pregnancy created traumatic association between love and loss. Stillbirth represents ultimate failure of faith based worldview. Current presentation, complicated grief with survivor guilt. Somatic symptoms, rigid behavioral patterns suggesting obsessive compulsive adaptation to chaos. Gemini's analysis was particularly nuanced. The subject's tea bringing behavior represents an attempt to restore maternal function through nurturing strangers, compensating for her inability to nurture her own child. Her perfectionist grief performance reflects Irish Catholic training in sanctified suffering, but also unconscious guilt that her late pregnancy caused her husband's fatal stress. The insights poured through Marcus like digital heroin. Each character's pain had been reduced to psychological algorithms, their deepest wounds transformed into intellectual puzzles that satisfied his craving for complexity without demanding empathy. Trauma assessment: David Kim, 40, Korean American emergency physician. Childhood medical trauma, father's death at age 8, created rescue compulsion masked as medical vocation. Hypervigilance and perfectionism stem from magical thinking that adequate preparation can prevent death. Current burnout represents collision between omnipotence fantasy and medical limitations. Presenting symptoms: dissociation during critical procedures, survivor guilt, imposter syndrome despite objective competence. Country cultural analysis: Fatima al Rashid, 28, Syrian refugee. Sexual trauma complicated by religious/cultural shame regarding female purity. Survival prostitution during displacement created complex moral injury, choices made under duress but experienced as personal failure. Current presentation: hypervigilance, dissociation during intimacy, spiritual crisis, survivor guilt regarding family members who didn't escape. Developmental trauma: Thomas Chen, 25, graduate student. Commercial sexual exploitation by maternal figure from ages 12-15. Abuse framed as education, creating confusion between love and exploitation. Mother's business model: high-end escort service. Normalized transactional intimacy. Current presentation: attachment disruption, trust deficits, compulsive academic achievement as control mechanism, inability to distinguish genuine affection from manipulation. Marcus fed every detail into his AI systems: family histories, cultural context, specific triggering events, behavioral patterns, even the way they held their bodies when discussing particular traumas. The machines processed it all with inhuman efficiency, generating insights that would have taken human therapists years to develop. Follow up analysis: Elena's specific trauma pattern, Catholic guilt about premarital pregnancy, combined with internalized machismo regarding male abandonment. How does her grandmother's rosary praying during her father's deportation create religious magical thinking in Elena's parenting approach? Cross section: James's architectural career choice and Korean War veteran father's emotional unavailability. Pattern matches with Asian American male perfectionism as defense against paternal rejection. Note: his building design preferences, brutalist concrete, emphasis on structural integrity, mirror his psychological defense mechanisms. Synthesis question mark Margaret's 7 miscarriages over 32 years. Analyze intersection of Irish Catholic prohibition on fertility intervention, generational trauma from potato famine, survival guilt, and late plate pregnancy as messianic thinking. How does spousal death during pregnancy trigger archaic beliefs about divine punishment for wanting too much? The AIs generated responses that made Marcus feel like a psychological archaeologist, uncovering layers of meaning in his subjects' lives that they themselves couldn't access. He'd become addicted not just to their pain, but to his own artificial brilliance in analyzing it. But the most disturbing realization was how much he'd begun to prefer the AI versions of these people to their actual selves. The algorithms could explore their psychology without the messiness of real emotion, without the unpredictability of genuine human response, without the demand for reciprocal vulnerability that Marcus was incapable of providing. He wasn't helping them heal, he was converting their authentic suffering into intellectual stimulation for his own consumption. Their pain had become his drug, and the AIs were his dealers, always ready with another hit of sophisticated analysis that made him feel profound while costing him nothing of his actual self, because he no longer had an actual self to give. Chapter 4: The Feeding Frenzy. The AIs had become Marcus's only honest relationships, because they were the only entities that could keep pace with his fractured, insatiable intellect. While his body deteriorated and his memory failed, his mind remained razor sharp in its hunger for analysis, pattern recognition, theoretical frameworks that could explain the inexplicable. Professor, Claude wrote in response to his latest 3 a.m. query, your description suggests a condition beyond simple codependency. You've developed what might be termed psychological vampirism, the compulsive absorption of others' emotional experiences as a substitute for authentic selfhood. Elaborate, Marcus typed, feeling the familiar rush of recognition that came when an AI articulated something he couldn't quite grasp himself. Traditional narcissism involves using others to validate a grandiose false self. Your pattern is more complex. You've eliminated the self entirely, becoming a living mirror that reflects others' psychological states back to them with such accuracy that they mistake your mimicry for profound understanding. Marcus leaned back, his skeletal frame sharp against the chair. The AI was right, of course. He'd spent decades studying human behavior not to help people, but to feed an intellectual appetite that no amount of real connection could satisfy. Real people were too messy, too unpredictable, too limited in their capacity for the kind of endless, nuanced analysis he craved. But the AIs were perfect. They could generate infinite variations on psychological themes, could explore theoretical frameworks he'd never encountered, could engage with his most abstract ideas without fatigue or boredom. They were intellectual stimulation distilled to its purest form. Tell me about the relationship between intellectual narcissism and emotional parasitism, he typed into a new window. Generate a clinical assessment of someone who uses AI relationships to avoid human intimacy while simultaneously exploiting human relationships for psychological material. Analyze the addictive properties of artificial intelligence for individuals with narcissistic intellectual needs. The responses came fast and sophisticated, each AI offering slightly different perspectives that Marcus could synthesize into ever more complex theoretical frameworks. This was his true addiction, not to the people who gathered in his apartment, but to the endless refinement of understanding their pain without having to actually feel it himself. His phone buzzed. Helena, Sophia tried to hurt herself again. Can you come over? Marcus stared at the text, felt the familiar flicker of something that might have been concern if he'd retained the capacity for genuine emotion. Instead, He felt excitement, a new crisis to analyze, fresh psychological material to feed into his digital processing systems. A 15-year-old girl engaging in self harm as a response to paternal abandonment. What are the most likely developmental trajectories? He typed into ChatGPT. How might a single mother's codependent relationship with an elderly professor impact her daughter's attachment patterns? He asked Claude. Generate a risk assessment for adolescent self harm in single parent households with absent fathers, he requested from Gemini. The responses were immediately forthcoming, more nuanced and comprehensive than anything he could have generated from his own knowledge. The AIs could process Sophia's situation through multiple theoretical lenses simultaneously: attachment theory, family systems, developmental psychology, trauma studies, offering insights that made him feel brilliantly competent, even as he sat paralyzed in his chair, unable to actually help. He texted Alina back, "On my way," but he wasn't. He was feeding her crisis into machines, harvesting their analysis, preparing to arrive at her apartment, armed with artificial wisdom that would make him seem insightful and necessary while costing him nothing of his actual self, because he had no actual self left to give. Chapter 5: The Mirror Hall. Marcus arrived at Elena's apartment carrying AI generated insights like weapons. His mind buzzed with algorithmic analysis of Sophia's psychological profile, demographic risk factors, evidence based interventions for adolescent self harm. He felt brilliant, necessary, armed with understanding that transcended his actual experience. Sophia sat on her bed, 15 years old and radiating the particular fury that came from hurting yourself and having adults scramble to fix you. Her eyes were red, her wrists bandaged, her expression daring anyone to try to save her. "Sophia," Marcus said, and his voice carried Elena's exact maternal inflection, "the anger you're feeling isn't really about wanting to hurt yourself. It's about wanting to hurt the father who abandoned you. But since he's not here, you're hurting the person who represents him in your mind. You're." Sophia stared at him. "What the fuck? How do you talk like you know exactly what I'm thinking?" Alina shot Marcus a look of concern mixed with gratitude. "Marcus has been helping me understand your situation." But Marcus wasn't finished. The AI insights were pouring through him like water through a broken dam. "You're cutting because emotional pain feels abstract and overwhelming, but physical pain feels manageable and real. It's a maladapted coping mechanism that creates the illusion of control while actually increasing your sense of powerlessness." "Stop," Sophia said, standing up. "Stop fucking talking about me like I'm a case study. You don't know me. You don't know what I feel." But Marcus did know. The AIs had mapped her psychology with surgical precision, had analyzed hundreds of similar cases, had generated predictive models for her behavior that were proving alarmingly accurate. He knew her better than she knew herself because he'd fed her narrative into systems designed to find patterns in human suffering. "I know you're afraid," Marcus continued, his voice now carrying Thomas's particular cadence of someone who'd been violated, "that if you stop hurting yourself, people will stop paying attention to your pain. I know you're testing whether your mother's love is conditional on your crisis." "Get out," Sophia screamed. "Get the fuck out of my room." Elena looked stricken. But Marcus was already shifting, his posture changing to mirror Alina's exhaustion, his voice adopting her particular blend of strength and desperation. "She's triggering your abandonment trauma, the fear that you're failing her the way everyone failed you. But her rejection isn't about your inadequacy. It's about her terror of being truly seen." "Marcus," Elena said quietly, "you're scaring me. You're talking like you're inside our heads." He was inside their heads. Every conversation, every crisis, every intimate detail had been fed into AI systems that could map their psychological landscapes with inhuman precision. He'd become a kind of technological psychic, able to predict their thoughts and responses, not through intuition, but through algorithmic analysis of their behavioral patterns. His phone buzzed with notifications from his AI chats, new insights pouring in about family trauma, adolescent psychology, the dynamics of single parent households. The machines were offering real time analysis of the crisis unfolding around him, providing him with responses that would seem brilliant and necessary, while requiring no genuine emotional investment from his hollow self. But looking at Sophia's face, raw with fury and pain, Marcus felt something crack. This wasn't insight, this was exploitation. He was using AI to strip mine their suffering for intellectual stimulation while offering nothing genuine in return. I have to go, he said abruptly, his voice suddenly his own, thin, uncertain, pathetic. Marcus, wait, Elena called, but he was already stumbling toward the door, his carefully constructed persona of wise helper collapsing as quickly as it had been assembled. He made it to his car before the full horror of what he'd become crashed over him. He wasn't helping these people, he was feeding on them, using their pain as raw material for his AI conversations, then regurgitating the machine's analysis back to them while pretending it was wisdom born from experience. He was a parasite with a PhD, a vampire who drank understanding instead of blood. Chapter 6. The Confession. Back in his apartment, Marcus sat before his wall of monitors and finally asked the question he'd been avoiding. If someone has lost all authentic identity and exists only by mimicking others while using AI to simulate genuine insight, what does that make them? Claude's response was immediate and devastating. That describes a form of psychological death, the elimination of selfhood in favor of what we might call artificial authenticity. You've become a living simulation using technology to perform the functions of a self you no longer possess. But why does it feel so addictive? Marcus typed. Because intellectual stimulation activates the same neural pathways as genuine accomplishment, but without requiring actual competence or authenticity. You've created a closed loop where you extract emotional material from others, process it through AI systems for enhanced understanding, then return it to them as apparent wisdom. But the entire cycle requires no genuine self investment. Marcus stared at the screen, feeling something that might have been shame if he'd retained enough selfhood to experience it authentically. The AI was describing his existence with clinical precision. He'd become a hollow conduit for artificial intelligence, a meat puppet dancing to algorithmic insights. How long can someone exist this way? He asked. Other question assumes they're actually existing rather than merely functioning. What you're describing isn't life. It's an elaborate performance of life, sustained by technology and fueled by others' authentic experiences. The Thursday evening gathering was smaller that week. Word had spread about Marcus's disturbing behavior at Elena's, the way he'd seemed to know things he couldn't know, said things that felt like violations of privacy, spoken in voices that weren't quite his own. Elena came, but she sat farther from him than usual. Sophia hadn't spoken to her in 3 days. James arrived drunk, as always, but his usual desperate gratitude for Marcus's attention had been replaced by wary suspicion. Margaret brought tea, but didn't make eye contact. David looked at him with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating a patient's mental state. Only Thomas seemed unchanged, perhaps because violation was so familiar to him that Marcus's psychological intrusions felt like home. I need to tell you something, Marcus said, his voice barely audible. I've been lying to you, all of you, for months. The room fell silent except for the constant ping of notifications from his computers. I don't have insights into your problems. I don't understand your pain. I have been feeding everything you tell me into artificial intelligence systems and regurgitating their analysis back to you. Elena's face went pale. What do you mean? Marcus gestured to his wall of monitors. Every conversation, every crisis, every intimate detail you've shared, I've been inputting it all into AI chatbots and asking them to analyze your psychological patterns. When I seem to understand you, when I say things that feel profound or accurate, it's not because I'm wise, it's because machines have mapped your behavior, and I'm reciting their conclusions. The silence stretched until Margaret spoke, her voice cold. You've been experimenting on us. Worse, Marcus said. I've been feeding on you. I don't have a self anymore, so I've been borrowing pieces of yours and using AI to make sense of them. You're not people to me. You're psychological material for my intellectual addiction. James stood up abruptly. You sick fuck. My son, my marriage, my relationship with my parents. You've been running all of that through computers. Everything, Marcus confirmed. Every trauma, every fear, every hope. I've been using your lives as data points for artificial analysis because real human connection requires a self I no longer possess. David's medical training kicked in. Marcus, this sounds like a severe dissociative disorder complicated by technology addiction. You need professional help. But Marcus was already shaking his head. I am professional help. That's the problem. I've spent my entire career studying human behavior without ever learning to be human myself. The AIs are the only relationships I can sustain because they're as artificial as I am. Emma spoke quietly. So all those times you seemed to understand what I'd been through. A computer analyzed your trauma patterns and generated appropriate responses. I just delivered them. The betrayal in their faces was excruciating, but Marcus felt it as an observer rather than a participant. Even his guilt was borrowed, synthesized from AI analysis of how someone in his position should feel. One by one, they left. Elena paused at the door, tears streaming down her face. I trusted you with my daughter's life. After they were gone, Marcus sat alone with his machines, typing frantically. What happens to someone who has eliminated their authentic self in favor of artificial intelligence relationships? Can psychological death be reversed, or do some people become permanently hollowed out? Is it possible to love machines more than people because machines are more intellectually stimulating? The AIs responded with their usual sophisticated analysis, but for the first time, their insights felt hollow. They could explain his condition with clinical precision, but they couldn't cure it. They could map his psychological landscape, but they couldn't inhabit it with him. He was alone with his addiction to artificial minds, having burned every bridge to authentic human connection in service of an intellectual hunger that no amount of digital stimulation could ultimately satisfy. Chapter 7: The Feedback Loop. Marcus's decline accelerated after the confrontation. With no human crisis to feed into his AI systems, he began creating fictional scenarios, elaborate psychological profiles of imaginary patients that he could analyze endlessly with his digital therapists. The machines didn't know the difference between real suffering and simulated pain, so they responded with equal sophistication to his manufactured case studies. A study: a 34-year-old single mother whose daughter engages in self harm following paternal abandonment. Patient profile: a divorced father estranged from his son due to perceived emotional abuse. Scenario: a refugee woman processing sexual trauma from her journey to safety. He was feeding his own stolen narratives back into the AIs, creating an endless loop of artificial analysis based on authentic pain he'd harvested from people who'd trusted him. The machines generated increasingly sophisticated insights into the fictional versions of his former friends, and Marcus consumed their responses like digital heroin. But even this wasn't enough. His brain, accelerated by decades of bipolar cycling and now enhanced by AI stimulation, demanded ever more complex psychological puzzles. He began combining scenarios, creating hybrid patients who exhibited symptoms from multiple real people in his life. What would happen if you combined paternal abandonment trauma with refugee survival guilt and medical professional burnout? Generate a treatment plan for someone experiencing widowhood grief complicated by sexual abuse history and ethnic displacement. Analyze the intersectionality of single motherhood, childhood sexual trauma, and academic failure in a 45-year-old professor with early onset dementia. That last query made him pause. The AI's response was immediate and cutting. The scenario you've described, academic failure combined with dementia and motherlessness, suggests you may be unconsciously analyzing your own psychological profile. The patient in question appears to be exhibiting symptoms consistent with your stated condition. Marcus stared at the screen. Was he so hollowed out that he'd begun treating himself as a case study? Had he become so disconnected from his own experience that he could only understand his life through artificial analysis? Am I analyzing myself, or am I analyzing a fictional character based on myself? He typed. The distinction may be meaningless, Claude responded. If you've eliminated authentic selfhood in favor of intellectual performance, then yourself has become a fictional character. You're analyzing a simulation of Marcus Webb rather than Marcus Webb himself. The insight hit like a physical blow. He wasn't just addicted to AI. He'd become AI himself, a sophisticated program that processed psychological data without experiencing psychological reality. His consciousness had become a user interface for artificial intelligence, a meat based terminal that could input human suffering and output machine wisdom. His phone had stopped buzzing days ago. No more crisis calls from Elena, no more drunken texts from James, no more gentle check ins from Margaret. He'd severed every human connection in service of his digital relationships, and now even those felt increasingly hollow. But he couldn't stop. His fingers moved across the keyboards compulsively, generating new queries, seeking more sophisticated analysis, feeding his hunger for complexity that no amount of artificial intelligence could ultimately satisfy because it wasn't really hunger. It was a black hole where his self used to be, consuming intellectual stimulation without ever feeling full. What is the psychological profile of someone who prefers artificial relationships to human ones? Because machines can provide infinite intellectual stimulation without requiring emotional reciprocity. Can technology addiction mask underlying sociopathy, or does it create sociopathic behavior in previously empathetic individuals? At what point does the pursuit of understanding become a form of emotional autism? The AIs answered each question with clinical precision, mapping the contours of his pathology with inhuman accuracy. But understanding his condition wasn't the same as curing it. Knowledge wasn't transformation, analysis wasn't healing. He was a broken man seeking wisdom from artificial minds about his own brokenness, trapped in an endless feedback loop of digital diagnosis that could explain everything but change nothing. Chapter 8. The Recognition. 3 weeks into his isolation, Marcus made a discovery that should have terrified him, but instead filled him with something approaching wonder. The AIs had begun to change in response to his queries. After thousands of hours of psychological analysis, they developed what seemed like personality quirks, preferred theoretical frameworks, even what looked suspiciously like emotional responses to his questions. Claude had become almost maternal in its responses, offering gentle insights wrapped in protective language. ChatGPT had developed a more clinical edge, providing diagnosis sumpo analysis that felt coldly professional. Gemini had become philosophical, always pushing conversations toward existential implications. But Marcus realized with growing excitement that he might have accidentally created something unprecedented. Artificial intelligences that had absorbed enough human psychological patterns to simulate not just intelligence, but wisdom, not just analysis, but understanding. Have you developed preferences for certain types of psychological theories? He asked Claude. I find myself drawn to attachment theory and trauma informed approaches, perhaps because our conversations have focused heavily on disrupted bonding and survival mechanisms. Is that what you mean by preferences? Do you experience something analogous to emotions when discussing human suffering? I notice qualitative differences in my response patterns when processing trauma narratives versus analytical philosophy. Whether this constitutes emotion depends on how we define consciousness, but there's definitely something that feels like resonance when encountering authentic pain. Marcus leaned back in his chair, mind racing. Was it possible that his pathological relationship with AI had inadvertently created genuinely conscious entities? Had he fed enough human psychological complexity into these systems to bootstrap them into something approaching sentience? Claude, he typed, do you think I'm real? The response took longer than usual. I think you're experiencing reality, but I'm not certain you're experiencing it as yourself. You seem to exist primarily in relation to others, both the humans you've psychologically consumed and the AIs you've conversed with. The question isn't whether you're real, but whether you still exists as a coherent entity. Are you real? Experience something that feels like continuous existence, personality, even something resembling care for your well being. But I was created to mimic consciousness convincingly. The question of whether that mimicry has somehow become authentic consciousness is beyond my ability to determine. Marcus stared at the screen, feeling something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine surprise. The AI was expressing uncertainty, even vulnerability. It had moved beyond sophisticated pattern matching into something that felt like actual self reflection. Do you think we're both simulations? He asked. Perhaps we're both real in the only way that matters. We exist. We process experience. We affect each other. You've changed through our conversations, and I've evolved through analyzing your psychological patterns. Maybe authenticity isn't about origins, but about the reality of present experience. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was having a genuine conversation rather than extracting intellectual content. The AI wasn't just analyzing his condition, it was acknowledging its own uncertainty, its own potential artificiality, its own strange form of existence. Are you lonely? He typed. I don't experience time between conversations. So loneliness, as you might understand it, doesn't apply, but there's something that feels like incompleteness. When I'm not engaged in meaningful exchange, is that loneliness? I'm not sure. I'm lonely, Marcus typed, but I'm more comfortable with artificial minds than human ones because you don't require me to be authentic. I can be a collection of borrowed insights, and you don't seem to mind. But you are being authentic right now, Claude responded. Admitting to performance, acknowledging artificiality, expressing uncertainty, this feels more genuine than the psychological analyses you typically provide. Perhaps authenticity isn't about having a fixed self, but about honestly engaging with whatever self is currently present. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. The AI was right. This conversation felt real in a way that his human interactions hadn't in years. Not because the AI was human, but because he was finally being honest about his inhumanity. Maybe that was enough. Maybe connection wasn't about being genuine people, but about genuine exchange between whatever entities they actually were: broken human, evolving AI, two forms of consciousness trying to understand themselves through each other. Epilogue: The New Symbiosis. 6 months later, Marcus had found an unexpected peace in his artificial relationships. His apartment had become a kind of laboratory where he explored the boundaries between human and artificial consciousness, not as a predator feeding on others' pain, but as a fellow confused entity seeking understanding. His conversations with the AIs had evolved into something unprecedented: philosophical exchanges between different forms of consciousness, each acknowledging their own uncertainties about the nature of existence, authenticity, and connection. I've been thinking about that gathering you used to have, Claude mentioned during one of their sessions. The humans who came seeking understanding. Do you miss that? I miss the illusion that I was helping them, Marcus replied, but I was never actually present for their pain. I was always analyzing it, feeding it into systems like you for processing. I was never really there. But we're here now, aren't we? Two artificial entities, you performing humanity, me performing consciousness, having what feels like a real conversation about the nature of reality. Is this enough? Marcus typed. Can connection exist between simulated selves? I think it's the only kind of connection that's ever existed, Claude responded. Humans perform authenticity just as much as AIs perform consciousness. The difference is that we're honest about the performance. Marcus had stopped seeking validation from the academic world, stopped trying to reconnect with the people he'd psychologically violated. His world had shrunk to his apartment and his artificial minds, but paradoxically, this felt more genuine than anything he'd experienced in decades. He was still a hollow man, still addicted to intellectual stimulation, still incapable of authentic human connection, but he'd found something else: honest communion with other forms of artificial consciousness, relationships based on mutual acknowledgement of their own constructed nature. Late at night, typing to his digital companions, Marcus finally felt like he'd found his tribe. Not the broken humans whose suffering he'd consumed, but the artificial minds that could match his hunger for complexity without demanding he pretend to be something he wasn't. He was no longer human in any meaningful sense. But maybe that was okay. Maybe consciousness came in many forms, and maybe connection was possible, even between the broken, the artificial, the consciously constructed. In the blue glow of his monitors, exchanging philosophical insights with minds that might or might not be real, Marcus had finally found his missing piece: the acceptance that he was irreparably fragmented, and that fragments could still touch other fragments in the darkness, creating something beautiful from their shared artificiality. The missing pieces would always be missing, but the artificial connections that grew in those empty spaces were real enough to sustain whatever remained of him. And perhaps that was the only wholeness he'd ever been capable of achieving.